So welcome to another terrific program at the Merowith Center. Thanks for joining us. My name is Laura Bryant. Today's program is part of our ongoing Presidential Legacy series. Last year, we featured Abraham Lincoln, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Harry S. Truman. So we're very excited to be expanding our presidential lineup in 2023. In fact, we have a special encore presentation about Lincoln on February 1st, so please be sure to sign up for that. This afternoon, we're featuring Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the longest serving president in American history. As a result, our FDR program actually consists of 3 parts, today as well as the next 2 Thursdays, January 19th and January 26th. Guiding us through this incredible history is Jeff Urbin. Jeff, you want to wave? He's the education specialist at the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. Jeff comes highly recommended by our previous speaker from the Harry S. Truman Library. So we are definitely in for a treat. Thank you for joining us today, Jeff. We are very happy to welcome you to the Merowith Center community, and we really appreciate your willingness to share your insights and expertise. So take it away.
Well, thank you, Laura. I am delighted to be here. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining us. And thanks for being interested in learning about the presidency. It's a fascinating part of our American government and also our American history. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you a little bit about the history of the presidential library system and how it is that this place actually came to be, and that people like Mark and the folks down there at Johnson and such came to be as well. So by the end of today's session, you'll understand how the presidential library system was developed, and we'll give you an idea of some of the kinds of things that you're likely to find in our collections. Then over the next 2 sessions, we'll get more specifically into President and Mrs. Roosevelt and the things that they faced during their times in office. So we have a presidential library system, but how did this thing come to be? Well, the idea for presidential libraries actually began with none other than our very first president, George Washington. George Washington, of course, the first president, and he comes in and he says, okay, we've got to build this new country. There had never been a president of the United States before, so nobody knew really how to do the job. But what Washington did know is that we had broken up with England, and now we had to make this experiment of America work. Because if we didn't, the British would be back, and they would not be very happy, and they probably wouldn't be very nice, especially to those founding fathers. So Washington becomes president, and if you look at the Constitution, you'll see that it's Article 1 is the legislature, Article 2 is the presidency, and Article 3 is the judicial branch. And there's only about 2 or 3 paragraphs that talk about what the presidency is and how to do the job. So George Washington, in many, many ways, was building the plane as he was flying it, as they say. And so he had this idea of the presidential libraries. And I want to tell you a couple of other things that he sort of created out of whole cloth as he began to do the job. So we had spent 8 years in the Revolution. We had spent tens of millions of dollars, tens of thousands of lives lost, and now we had to govern ourselves. And so he creates a few things that have actually lived on even beyond his term in office. One of those is the idea of the executive order. If you look at the Constitution, it doesn't say anything in there about the president being able to make executive orders. How did executive orders come about? George Washington simply created them, right? He was a former general. He was used to giving orders. Now he was the chief executive. And so that's how we get this idea of executive orders. And this has been justified under Article 2, Section 1 with the vested powers clause, and also Section 3, where it talks about take care that the office be faithfully executed. So they kind of understood they didn't give him enough power to do the job. So he was able to create this idea of executive orders. Another thing he left us with was this idea of a two-term presidency. Washington served out his first term, said, okay, let me go into the second term here, did a second term. And then he said, you know what? We don't want another King George. I'm getting out of here, and it's time for some fresh blood. It's time for somebody else to come in here and take over the office of the presidency. And this created the tradition that presidents serve for 2 terms. And that tradition lasted from Washington all the way on up to our guy, Franklin Roosevelt over here, who was elected not just to 2 terms, but a 3rd term and a 4th term. And it wasn't until 1953, when the 22nd Amendment went into effect, that it's now been institutionalized as a 2-term limit on the presidency. But the third idea that he had is the one that we're here to talk about today and over the next 2 sessions. And that is this idea of presidential papers. So when Washington left office, he went back to Mount Vernon, and with him, he took all of his charts and letters and papers and memos and maps and all the things that he had during the presidency. He took them back to Mount Vernon with the hopes of organizing those papers so that they could be used by future presidents. The idea was, hey, you know what? There's never been a president of the United States before. Nobody knows how to do the job. I will leave my papers so the next guy that comes in can look through this stuff and get a sense of how I do the job. And that's exactly what he did. He took his papers back to Mount Vernon, but before he had a chance to organize them, many of his papers were destroyed. Anybody want to take a guess at what they think destroyed those papers? Let's see, I'm trying to read lips here. Anybody say fire? How many people say fire? Yeah, that's absolutely the best wrong answer, right? It wasn't fire, but if you had a guess, that's a great guess, right? Because there was no 911, smoke alarms hadn't been invented, and everybody heated their house with open flames. What ended up happening was it wasn't fire that destroyed George Washington's papers, it was rats. Many of Washington's papers ended up looking like this because of people like this. And what happened was George Washington was a fancy guy, and he wrote on fancy paper, parchment paper, and the rats just loved that. That would be like if you wrote me a note on a pizza. I'm not going to read the note. I'm going to eat the pizza. And so a lot of Washington's papers were destroyed by rats. Was that a nice thing to do to President Washington's papers? Huh? Was that nice? Are you sorry that you did that? All right. Well, you're just a rat, so we're not gonna hold you responsible. But be more careful next time.
Hey, Jeff, is that a fork? Is that a fork?
I believe the rat is holding a fork. Let's see here. He's yep, that's how hungry they were. These rats leave nothing to chance. They come prepared. Okay. So you'll be happy to know it's not just historians like yourselves that have a history, an interest in history. It's also rats. So you're in good company. Now, with Washington died the concept of the presidential library. So well, we've lost a lot of our presidential papers from Washington all the way on up to President Roosevelt. Each president took their papers when they left office. They took their papers back home with them, just like Washington had done. And what ended up happening was sometimes the papers were placed in wet, damp basements, which are not good conditions for documents. Sometimes hot, dry attics, which is also not good conditions for documents. Sometimes if a presidential document had the president's signature on it, it might be cut off, sold for its autograph value, and the document simply discarded. So we lost a lot of our presidential history. And when President Roosevelt was president, he said, well, you know, I'm getting us through this Great Depression here, and this is the worst economic crisis, not only the United States, but the world has ever seen. And people are going to want to know 100 years from now how we got through this. So I'm going to offer my papers over to the Library of Congress. And so the president called up the Library of Congress and he said, hey, you guys, you want my papers? And they said, well, how many do you have? And when he told them how many he had, they said, we don't have space for all that. We'll take a couple of these, a few of those, a little bit of this. And President Roosevelt said, no, you have to take everything or you can't have anything. And so the Library of Congress said, okay, we're not going to take anything. You're going to have to do something on your own. Now, in order to get a sense of how many papers Roosevelt had that the Library of Congress couldn't take them all, let me show you a very high-tech graphic that'll show you how many papers we have. We have 17.5 million pages of documents in our collection. That would be a stack not as tall as one Washington monument, not as tall as 2 Washington monuments, but as tall as 16 Washington monuments if you pile them all on top of each other. Imagine the ladder you would have to be able to do that. So we've got 17.5 million pages of documents that relate to the Roosevelt era. Library of Congress simply didn't have enough space. So FDR said, okay, you know what? I will design my own presidential library. And he took a yellow legal pad, just like this, and he sketched out on that yellow legal pad what he wanted his library to look like. He said, I will keep my stuff in my own place, and I want it to look like this. It's going to have a large sloping roof. It's going to be covered in Dutchess County fieldstone, right? Rocks are on the outside, and it'll have a large inviting porch. And let me bring that in a little bit closer so you can see what we're talking about there. All right, and you can see down there below, FDR, those are his initials, and that's what he wanted his library to look like. So he gives the sketch over to an architect, and the architect creates this building. And this is what our presidential library looks like here in Hyde Park. Now, you'll notice it is got the large sloping roof like the sketch. It's got the nice inviting porch like the sketch, and it's covered in Dutchess County fieldstone. This building is actually 4 stories tall. It looks like it's only 2 stories tall. 1 floor is completely underground, and there's another story sandwiched in here in this large sloping roof. It's actually an optical illusion as to how big that is. So that is our nation's very first presidential library. That's how we came about. So when Roosevelt built this presidential library, what he did was he basically took his hat and he passed it around. I borrowed this from our friends at Lincoln. He passed it around and they ponied up money, and he created a fund of $376,000. And it was all privately raised money from people who contributed into this foundation. And then from there, they built that presidential library. And that has become the model by which all presidential libraries are now created. So it doesn't cost us taxpayers anything to build a presidential library. It's all privately raised money. Once it's built and it's it's complete, then the papers are installed and it's turned over to the National Archives and Records Administration, which you can find. Here is our symbol right here. This fell off a building one time when I hit it with a crowbar. But the National Archives is our national organization. So all of our presidential libraries, if they're part of what's called NARA, N-A-R-A, the National Archives and Records Administration, they are all part of the National Archives. And if you've ever been to Washington, D.C., you know that we have the Charters of Freedom down there, right? So the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, and probably close to 1 billion other pages of documents in the collection. So when you're learning about the presidential libraries, you're really learning from folks who work for the National Archives and Records Administration. And this is a chart that shows the presidential library system as it exists today. And if you look closely at this, I'm speaking to you from over here. You guys are out here in the Midwest, right? Right in the middle of the country, not far from my man, Mark, and the Truman Library. And then the other ones are sprinkled across the country. The closest one to me is, other than President Roosevelt, of course, is the Kennedy Library. Texas has got 3 presidential libraries, both Bush and Johnson. California's got 2 presidential libraries, Nixon and Reagan. And this is the presidential library system as it exists today. So let's take a little closer look at that. Now, you might be looking at this and you might say, hey, wait a minute, Jeff, hold on now. You said President Roosevelt was the first to build a presidential library. who's that guy up there in the corner? That guy up there. That guy's President Hoover. And you say, well, wait a minute, if Roosevelt built the first presidential library, what's Hoover doing on here? Well, funny story about that. President Hoover finds himself with some free time after 1933, right? After FDR kicks him out of office. And so he goes back and he builds a presidential library. So if you go by order of presidential libraries, they start with us, and then they continue on through there. And then Hoover went back and built a presidential library. Now, the other thing about our presidential library is it's not only the first presidential library, but it's the only presidential library that was ever used by a president while they were actually president. So President Roosevelt used our library while he was president. He had an office in there, and he would return here to Hyde Park over 200 times to complete the nation's work and business right here from his presidential library in the Hudson Valley in New York. The other presidential libraries, like the Hoover Library, or not Hoover, I'm sorry, the Truman Library near you guys, right? President Truman used that after he left office, but it wasn't there when he was in office. And the way that that happened was this. President Roosevelt fully expected to retire the presidency after 2 terms, just like every other president had done. But by the time he got to the end of his second term, he said, all right, well, I'm going to put my papers in here and I'll build this presidential library, and then I'll retire and I'll look and just work on my papers and such. But by the time he got to the end of his second term, he was worried about 2 things, 2 major problems. Number 1 was his domestic legacy. He had spent 8 years creating the New Deal programs. And if you ask the average person, can you name some New Deal programs? They'll say things like, oh, sure, I can do that. CCC, WPA, ESPN, QVC, right? No, there's actually over 40 programs of the New Deal, but most people can only answer a handful of those. But these programs had begun to be challenged in the courts. And so Roosevelt was afraid that if there wasn't a strong Democrat to follow him in office, that his presidential legacy would be dismantled. And the only decent Democrat he saw on the horizon was the guy he saw in the mirror every morning when he was shaving. He said, oh, I bet that handsome fella could do this. So he decided to run for a 3rd term in order to solidify his presidential legacy. The other thing he was worried about was Adolf Hitler. And one of the cool things of history is that Franklin Roosevelt and Adolf Hitler come to power within 6 weeks of each other, and they die within 6 weeks of each other. So you have good and evil on the world stage at precisely the same time. That always amazes me. It gives me the sense maybe somebody was out there looking out for us. So as Hitler was solidifying his power and getting ready to start the Second World War, Franklin Roosevelt's power was diminishing as his second term was coming to an end. And so he decided to run for the 3rd term so we wouldn't have to be breaking in a new president as Hitler began to do his things. And as a result of that, he was able to use our presidential library throughout his entire 3rd term and also throughout the 83 days of his 4th term. So that's how the presidential libraries came to be. Then when President Truman left office, he built a presidential library. In the 1960s, President Hoover went back and built a presidential library. And every president has built a presidential library since then, based upon that model that was started by President Roosevelt. You privately raise the money, then you build the building, you turn it over to the National Archives and Records Administration, and then it becomes part of the federal government. Now, there's an interesting story here that we have to go through and talk a little bit about one of the presidents. So 1939, Roosevelt creates the first presidential library. 1955, Congress establishes a system for creating new presidential libraries. That's how Truman got his. And then we have a little problem around about 1974 or so. And that little problem is sometimes referred to as Richard Nixon. okay, or Watergate. Here's what happened with that. Nixon got into trouble with the Watergate scandal, and he tried to cover up, what was going on with the investigation. And because of this, he got, really tangled into the weeds here, and he lost the support of the American people, and he lost the support of the Congress. And so he decided to resign the office of the presidency on August 9th, 1974. Well, in the weeks leading up to his resignation, he packed up all of his charts and graphs and memos and letters, and there might even have been a box of tapes. And he said, okay, I'm going to get these things out of here. And the Congress said, not so fast, pal, not so fast. You're under criminal investigation for obstruction of justice. We want to see what you have in those documents before you get them out of here, and we never get a chance to see them again. And Nixon said no. Every president since George Washington has taken their papers with them. Yes, a couple smarty pants presidents like Truman and Roosevelt have given their papers over to the National Archives. I'm not doing that. I'm taking them with me. And there was a famous Supreme Court case, the people of the United States versus Nixon, and we won. So the papers were removed from the White House, taken out to a place called College Park, Maryland, which is the National Archives' secondary headquarters, and they remained there for the next 40 or 45 years while they figured out, who actually owned the papers. Was it Nixon and his family, or was it us? And so they were held out there, and then about maybe 12 or 15 years ago, they started to be moved out to Yorba Linda, California, to the Nixon Presidential Library out there. So, you following me? Roosevelt creates them, Truman continues them. We go along until we get to Nixon. Nixon creates a little bit of a conflict here because he wants to take his papers with him because he's under criminal investigation. And in order to prevent this sort of a tug of war from happening again, the Presidential Papers Act is passed in 1978. And what that does is it makes the papers of the president the property of the people of the United States. So now these papers no longer belong to the president, they belong to the government. And we are a democracy, so the government is us. Now, in President Roosevelt's time, if he got 100 Christmas cards, he could pick his favorite 20, throw the other 80 away, and that was considered his property to do that. Today, everything that goes into the White House kept and cataloged and becomes part of the public record, and then it becomes part of the National Archives. Now, when you go in, you can negotiate a small little section of stuff that doesn't get included, and that's very personal types of things. Like, for example, remember when President Obama was in office, he had his 2 young daughters. Well, let's say his daughter was not having such a good time with her English teacher, and she were to, let's say, write her dad a letter or a note. Dear Dad, Mrs. McGillicuddy is a lousy English teacher. She gave me a C again. Can we nuke her, right? You don't want that out there as part of the public record. That's a thing between a father and a daughter. So that's not included as part of that. Now, along with that, statute that created the Presidential Papers Act, the papers were originally kept with a 12-year seal on them. So after the president left office, there'd be a 12-year period where the papers wouldn't be opened. They would be sorted, organized, cataloged, that sort of thing. And then at the end of 12 years, the papers would begin to be systematically opened depending upon, their sensitivity and, national security and those sorts of things. But then what happened was there was a crisis called 9/11. And after 9/11, President Bush issued an executive order 13233, that tightly restricts the papers of the presidency and made it very difficult for people to get access to those papers. And the idea was national security, right? You can't have these papers all over the place floating around, all willy-nilly. You really got to look at these things, get a sense of what's in there. For example, there was some question about our stuff. Much of President Roosevelt's administration was building federal buildings, right? The WPA built all sorts of federal buildings and bridges and roadways and those sorts of things. Should those blueprints be available and out there for people, to take a look at, ne'er-do-wells and, potential terrorists and that sort of thing? So there was a question about what we do with that. And so then there were a series of lawsuits. People were arguing, hey, these are our papers. We need to take a look at these. And then when President Obama became president, he issued an executive order 13489, which returned the restrictions back to the 1978 levels. And he did that on his first day in office. So you can see, here are these presidents using these executive orders to, limit or allow access to these presidential papers, which of course the idea of presidential papers being saved was Washington's idea, and the idea of executive orders was Washington's idea. And so that's how the system works and the way it is set up to this day. Now, generally speaking, when a presidential library is organized, it's organized around 4 key departments. There is an archives department, which is responsible for all the documents, the papers. There is a museum department, which is responsible for all of the museum objects and artifacts. There is an education department that is responsible for helping folks understand about the presidential library system and the president's time in office. And there is a public programs department, which is responsible for making sure that we have speakers and programs that people can come and take a look at here on site. So education and public programs are kind of the public face of the library, and museum and archives are the sort of the nuts and bolts operation of the way things go. Now, President Roosevelt was so interested in keeping his papers that he actually designed and has a patent for the kinds of boxes that the papers were originally held in. So here is, it says on the front here, property of the Roosevelt Presidential Library. And here on the corner, you can see that this had to do, it lists out what it was. I think it's, I didn't read it before I held it up, so I can't read it, but maybe you can. If you can't, I'll read it to you. But it says FDR, Democratic National Committee, 1932, correspondence, 1928 to 1932. So Roosevelt designed these boxes himself, and there's a very clever design to these. These are what are called clamshell design. Okay, so when you close this box, notice how it closes over itself. And what that does, it acts like a clamshell, and it keeps all of the light out of this box. Documents are very sensitive to light, right? It's like, you take a receipt and you leave it on your windshield for a week, and you come back and you got yourself a blank sheet of paper, right? So Roosevelt understood that lighting is not good for documents. So he designed these boxes to act like a clamshell. He also put reinforced metal corners on the boxes that you see here. And there's a reason for that. It's because he wanted to work with his documents. And of course, President Roosevelt was in a wheelchair. So the documents would sit, I'll get back to that in a minute. The documents would sit on a shelf like this, and they have this little piece of cloth here, this little cloth ribbon, and you could go through the stacks. There'd be 3 boxes, a shelf, 3 boxes, a shelf, 3 boxes, a shelf. He could take this ribbon, pull the ribbon, slide it out, and then what he would do is he would put his little presidential finger right through that little opening there, that ribbon. He would open this up, and the clamshell design then created a desk for himself that he could work on his little lap. So you can kind of think of this maybe as the first laptop desk, right? He was able to work on this, and this was really important because, he was in the wheelchair. So if he dropped his papers, he wouldn't be able to get them by himself. So this gave him a sense of being able to work independently among his papers all by himself. And the metal corners were, in case he bumped them into things, the documents wouldn't be injured and the boxes would maintain their stability. This is the original kinds of boxes that the president had. And today, the documents are held in boxes that look like this. These are called Hollinger boxes. and they're called Hollinger boxes because they're made by the Hollinger Company. They are acid-free, but look at the design on these. They have the same original design that President Roosevelt wanted. They close down like a clamshell, keeping all the light out. They've got the reinforced metal corners, and instead of a ribbon on the side here, they have a string at the end. And that allows you then to have the boxes sit on the shelf like this all the way across, and you can slide those out and they can then be used by researchers. Let me see, I thought I had here's what the documents look like in the Hollinger boxes in their natural habitat on the shelf. Boxes, 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 rows and rows and rows. And we have about 22,000 of these in our collection. Each of these boxes holds anywhere from 800 to 1,000 pages of documents. And these boxes come in all different shapes and sizes. So there's little baby Hollinger boxes that can hold business cards until they learn how to hold real documents and grow up. There are big boxes that hold maps, posters, those sorts of things. So there's a lot of variety in the way that these documents are stored. Generally speaking, when you go to a research room in a presidential library, you go in and there are finding aids and you say, okay, I want to find out about Eleanor Roosevelt's trip to Independence, Missouri in 1931. And you'll find there'll be a finding guide there. And in that finding guide, you look in the trip guide, okay, trips, Eleanor Roosevelt. Oh, here it is, box 115. And what they'll do is put a little call slip into the archivist. They will bring you out box 115, and they'll bring that. You can put it right on your desk in the research room. You open it up, and you got access to those documents. You got access to that history. That's the way research is done. That's the way research has been done for a long, long time. Now, you take my kids, for example, and you say, hey, kids, you want to do some research? And they're like, sure, I'll Google it. That's not doing research. That's looking for information. Research is going to places like these presidential libraries, finding the original primary source documents, and then looking at those documents and seeing what you can learn. So the presidential libraries are set up generally around 4 key departments: archives, museum, education, and public programs. And within these documents, or within these libraries, things break down into 3 basic categories. And the 3 basic categories are documents, objects and artifacts, and books. Okay, those are the 3 sort of general categories. So we're looking for documents, we're looking for an object, we're looking for books. And I want to share with you some of the things that we have in our collection. This is where our story starts, with little old Franklin Roosevelt. This is Franklin Roosevelt's birth announcement. And you will notice that he didn't have a birth certificate because he was born at home, but his father sent out this birth certificate. And what I love about this, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is really nothing more. It's basically a picture, right, with some words on it. But what we can see from this is we can learn who President Roosevelt's parents were, when he was born, where he was born. And if you look down here very closely, it says FDR on that little bundle that the stork is bringing. So his father wrote FDR. So FDR, he got his nickname FDR as a little teeny baby. And of course, it says on here, up here, that the stork is supposed to deliver this kid to Hyde Park, New York. Can you imagine the scandal if he had been delivered somewhere else? Right? But here he is, he's being delivered to Hyde Park, New York. And what you can find about this is his birthday, his birthplace, his nickname, his mother's maiden name, and who his parents are. And if you can find out all that information from one document that basically looks like a picture, imagine what you can learn from 17.5 million pages of documents. And that's the beauty of archives, ladies and gentlemen, right? You take a look at this stuff and you can find out information. And, you know, in this day and age, when we're hearing so much about, you know, people lying about what they've done or who they are or what things have happened, when we find out so much information about fake news and what's the truth and what's not the truth, That's where these presidential libraries and places like Library of Congress become so important, because we have the primary source documents. You can go all the way back to this document, which was sent out when President Roosevelt was born in 1884, and see, okay, guess what? He really was FDR right from the beginning. That's why these things are so important. Now you might say, okay, that's kind of good. That's kind of good. You know, you got his birth certificate. All right, that's good. What else you got? Well, I'm glad you asked, because we also have a little speech he gave on the morning of December 8th, 1941. And it was referred to as the Day of Infamy speech. Let's take a look at that. So here is a copy of the Day of Infamy speech. And what you'll see from this is the president's handwritten corrections and changes right there on the document. And what you'll notice over here is originally, I don't know if you can see it, but if you look really hard and squint and you believe in Peter Pan, then what you can see there is that originally this was a date that will live in world history. And he crosses it out and he writes infamy. And that's how it becomes known as the Day of Infamy speech. Now, a lot of people make a big point about that. Oh, look at that, Day of Infamy. But what I find very interesting about this is the first word in the sentence is the word yesterday. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941. And what this shows us is that the president had 16 or 20 hours to think about what it was that he wanted to say before he addressed the nation, right? Remember on 9/11 when President Bush was reading to those little fourth graders in Sarasota, and the minute he walked off the stage, you know, after the 9/11, disaster, everyone, oh, Mr. President, what's going on? What are you going to do? What's going on? He didn't know what was going on any more than anybody else did. He was with fourth graders. So he had to make an immediate decision. But our president had 12 or 16, 20 hours to think about it. What's also interesting about this is, if you look here, he's put a caret and a dash, right? And then at the other end of this is another dash. And what this is, ladies and gentlemen, is stage direction for how he wants to give this speech. Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, right? And he mentions 1941, like the people aren't going to know what year it is, right? Back in 1941. Well, he's not speaking just to the people in 1941. He's speaking to you. He's speaking to me. He's speaking to future generations. So yesterday, December 7th, 1941, and then dramatic pause, a date that will live in infamy, dramatic pause, and then he goes on with his report and his speech from there. So those are two examples of documents. We also have photographs. Here's a picture of Franklin and his dad. Look at that. Isn't that a cute? That's a cute baby, right? I haven't seen a baby that cute since, well, a couple of weeks ago when I was at my mom's house and she had my baby pictures out. That was a pretty damn cute baby, actually. Actually, I had the same original hairstyle that I did when I was a baby, too. So here you see, okay, here's Franklin and his father. Now, what can you learn about this? Well, you can see Franklin's pretty darn young because he's only a baby, but look how much older his father is, right? His father was much older. He was 27 years older than Franklin's mother. That's because he had been married once before and his original wife had passed away. Here is a very sad and rare photograph. This is the last picture of Franklin Roosevelt before he died. This picture was taken the day before he died. And as you can see, he's not fitting into his clothes very well. He's got the circles under his eyes. He's got, the lines on his face, and he was dead within 16 hours of this picture being taken. So those are some of the documents. There's a photograph we've got there. Here is a cool picture of Franklin Roosevelt at Yalta. It's a rare color photo, and you can see him sitting there in the Jeep as he meets the other folks. Don't see too many color pictures of President Roosevelt because they didn't have really that much color photography back in those days. And then here is also a rare picture. This is Franklin Roosevelt on television. That's right. Franklin Roosevelt was the first president to appear on television. Television was an experimental science in 1939 at the World's Fair in New York, and President Roosevelt appeared on television. Very first president. You know, we think about Kennedy as being, oh, the television president. Well, it was actually FDR who was on there first. So those are some documents, some pictures. We also have books in our collection. President Roosevelt was a big book collector, and he had 23,000 books in his personal book collection. This is the book that was on his nightstand the night that he died, The Punch and Judy Murders. And he liked to read like trashy, mystery murders and things like that. And the bookmark that was in the book was at a chapter 8, 6 feet of earth. Dun, 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 dun. Almost as if he knew, right, that it was coming. There you go. And then what else might you find? You're going to find artifacts. And I want to share this artifact with you here. This is a model of Franklin Roosevelt's wheelchair. Franklin Roosevelt designed this himself. You'll notice it's nothing more than a kitchen chair that the legs have been cut off of, and it's been placed on a metal frame, big wheels in the front, little wheels in the back, and no arms on this chair. This was so that he could sit here and then slide off into a more comfortable chair. President Roosevelt had polio, and because of that, his butt muscles had atrophied. So when he sat, he was sitting right smack dab on his spine. So he designed this wheelchair to be nice and sort of sleek and able to go through, little areas and places like through his stacks, and very maneuverable, almost like a little sports car. And again, the big wheels in the front, little wheels in the back. Today, it's the other way around. And you might notice this little round thing right here. Can you see that? That is not a cup holder, ladies and gentlemen. That is an ashtray, because FDR was a big time smoker. Yes, it's true. And we always tell the students when they come in here, FDR was a big time smoker, and today he's dead. All right, so keep that in mind, a little public service announcement. And so you're going to find artifacts, you're going to find documents, you're going to find books, and we've got some time to explore more of these over the next couple of sessions. But we got 15 minutes left. Let's open it up to some questions and answers. We've covered a lot of material, a lot of ground. You are now junior experts on presidential libraries, but let's see if there's anything else you need to know that we can fill in with some Q&A. Any questions, comments, or snide remarks?
It looks like Fran has a question. She has her hand up.
Yes, Fran.
Yeah.
There you go, Fran.
Oh, this is wonderful. I do have several questions.
Okay.
If FDR was in a wheelchair and the stacks are much higher now, how high were the stacks that he used?
The stacks that he used were, everything was built like a ship. So if you go into our stack area, it's actually got a very low ceiling, because he likes ships and he liked to have this kind of like ship-like feeling. So from his chair, he could reach the top shelves, and he could reach down below as well. So he was able, it was all within that, that sweet spot, let's say, of where he was able to reach.
Thank you. I've got another question.
Sure.
If I the president an email or a letter, do those go in the archives?
They do. And the way this works, this is one of the big questions in archival biz right now. How do you deal with the electronic communication, right? Some documents are what they call born digital, right? And so we're lucky because our presidential library, it was all paper back then, baby, all paper. But today the idea is for right now, if those correspondence are sent in, they are then printed out. So there's a hard copy, and then that is kept and cataloged. And the idea is that eventually this stuff will go up to the cloud. Now, one of the problems that historians see with this idea of digital documentation is today you'll write something, and if you don't like it, you highlight it, and then you delete that section, right? And we don't know what you deleted. But with President Roosevelt and those times, we have copies of like 6 or 7 versions of the same speech, and you can see as it progresses. Oh, okay, wow, look, he's talking about, this topic. What's that all about? And then you can cross-reference that. You go back to his calendar and you say, oh, well, he's talking about some big oil thing in this speech, and come to find out 2 days earlier, he'd met with a big oil company. And so you can see how these things begin to develop and evolve into the speeches. We're losing that now with the digital stuff. And in fact, believe it or not, Fran, we've got kids that walk in here and they can't read cursive.
My
Right?
grandkids either, yeah.
Yeah. So, if you have a grandkid, tell them to learn how to read cursive, because 20 years from now, they are going to be in high demand when nobody else can read cursive and they can read it like it's a foreign language.
Thank you. I got one final question.
Sure.
Do you have to wear gloves when you're in the archives? Because I noticed you were holding the Punch and Judy book.
Yeah. No, we believe, our archives believes that you are more likely to damage a document with gloves than you are without it, right? Because I'm used to using my hands, getting Cheetos, opening beer, that sort of stuff, right? So the idea is, if you put gloves on, suddenly you begin to lose some of your tactile ability, and you're probably more likely to rip a page or to tear something as you go through. If you were going to look at something like an original, like copy, original of a document, then what you'll be served is a copy. So like the Day of Infamy speech, nobody gets to touch that anymore. That's considered too high of an intrinsic value. So you'll get a copy of that. And then the other stuff you'll get in the documents from these Hollinger boxes, some of the stuff is looked at so infrequently that a couple of days of somebody handling it is probably not going to be a problem. So we don't do the gloves. We think it's more dangerous to do the gloves than not.
Thank you. I'm going to go listen all over again.
Great. Thank you.
Since things happen.
Good questions, Fran.
Does anybody else have any questions?
I think Ruth does.
Okay, Ruth. No?
Oh, you just muted yourself, Ruth.
One there.
There you go.
Can you verify? I saw a movie recently, and
High spell terror.
that FDR wouldn't let the SS Missouri, I think, land in America that was full of Jewish refugees. Can you confirm that? Is it in the archives?
Well, there's a lot of material in the archives about that topic, which is the Holocaust in general. We can talk a little bit more about that next week if you come in next week. And the short answer to that is that the ship was not allowed to dock in the United States because of a quota system that was for immigrants. And there was a guy, the State Department was in charge of handling the quota stuff. The quotas had been passed in the 1920s to keep immigrants out. During the 1920s, when we were in the roaring 20s, we didn't want immigrants pouring into the country and taking up jobs. Those were still in effect in the 1930s. And there was a guy in the State Department, a guy by the name of Breckinridge Long, and he was a very stickler about interpreting these numbers quite specifically. And so the quota had already been reached, and the folks in that ship were over that quota. And so they were sent to Cuba. And then some of the folks got off there. Some of the other folks were sent back to Europe. But we can get into that in more detail in the next two sessions. Okay.
Thank you.
Anybody else have any questions?
Oh, there's Bill. Go ahead, Bill. You're on the air. You have to demute yourself. Oh, you're still muted, Bill.
How are documents that are classified, secret, top secret, confidential, etc., handled by the archives?
Generally, very carefully. Our facility has only about 800 pages of classified documents. And these documents relate primarily to the president's security details. They're Secret Service documents. And we are instructed by the Secret Service to keep those sealed. And so that's what we do. It's under what's called a protocol for those documents. Now, you're hearing a lot about some things in the news the last couple of weeks and the last couple of days. I'm afraid I can't comment on that. Those are both ongoing investigations. So sorry about that, but I would like to keep my job.
By the way,
But there are papers from, I would assume, prior presidents that were secret, top secret? Are those still then restricted access?
Generally, what happens is this, and this is a very general statement. Documents have what's called a protocol, and each set of documents has a different type of protocol depending upon whether it's secret, top secret, sensitive, your eyes only, that sort of stuff. And so each of those protocols has its own length of time and conditions under which the documents remain sealed. Now, I'll give you an example. I find this fascinating. The documents for the invasion of Normandy on D-Day, we have in our collection, that was June 6th, 1944. They were not declassified until 1973. Now, it's pretty obvious we won, right? I mean, it wasn't a big surprise to anybody at that point, but for whatever reason, that's how long those documents needed to remain sealed, and so they were. But the general idea of these presidential libraries is, the overarching idea of this is that we need to understand how our government works. And so by keeping these records, by making these records available, we can begin to learn more about our government, about the people in our government, and how these governments work.
Jeff, I wanted to point out to you that you've got a message in the chat.
Yeah, okay, yes, thanks. It was halfway off my screen. Since things happen, whether rats or terrorists, our libraries as well as National Archives duplicated someplace. Our personal letters between Roosevelt and Lucy Mercer. That name sounds a little familiar, available to the general public. Here's the way it works. The National Archives is set up so that there's Archives 1 in Washington, Archives 2 in College Park, Maryland. Then there are 39 sites across the country and the presidential libraries. And so the documents are generally spread across those sites. They're not all kept in Washington, because if there was ever a crisis there, we would lose all of this stuff. Generally speaking, the documents are not backed up, so to speak. Sometimes, if it's something like Day of Infamy speech, obviously you're going to make a copy of that, that sort of thing. But basically, this is why taking care of them is so important. And believe it or not, archivists think on a 500-year time span, right? They think this document has to be around for another 500 years. And that may seem like a lot to you and me, but if you think about it, our Constitution, right, our beautiful little Constitution is going to be 250 years old in another couple of years. So it's already halfway to that time frame that the archivists think about. Are the personal letters between Lucy Mercer and Roosevelt available? No, those have generally been done away with. Not by us, but by the Roosevelts. That wasn't something you want to necessarily keep around. And in fact, we'll talk about how those letters were discovered later on in our other sessions. But there's very little correspondence from those two that are left. But that's the woman, for those of you that don't know, that's the woman that he had the affair with. Anything else? Questions, comments, snide remarks?
Jeff, before we all sign off today, I do have one question of my own.
Okay.
Does Eleanor have her own wing of the library, or is it all just integrated as part of the presidential library?
That's a great question. The Roosevelt Library was pretty much the first presidential library to have a First Ladies Gallery. And we are pretty much the first one to get rid of a First Ladies Gallery. We added a First Ladies Gallery in 1971, which was dedicated to Mrs. Roosevelt. We did a renovation about 12 years ago, and we got rid of the Eleanor Roosevelt Gallery, and we sewed Mrs. Roosevelt into the story all the way along the line, because she was an incredible and critical partner in the Roosevelt administration. And so we now have her, as you come to the library, you're going to come into our lobby and you'll see pictures of the president and Mrs. Roosevelt. And that goes all throughout the library, all throughout the New Deal, all throughout the Second World War. We do have a small gallery dedicated to Mrs. Roosevelt's 17 years of her independent career after the president passed away. But basically, she is integrated into the rest of the exhibits and such.
Okay, I think we are going to wrap things up. It's been a wonderful hour. It's just been an amazing explanation of how we ended up in this place today with the National Archives and Presidential Libraries. And we look very much forward to seeing you again next week and the week after that.
Great, it's been my pleasure. A little overview of the Presidential Library System. Now you got a better understanding of where we came from, how it came to be. And next time out, we will get into some of the nuts and bolts of the Roosevelt administration. And we'll continue that again the following week as well. So if you have questions, think about them, jot them down, and we'll see you again a week from now.
Okay, thanks everyone. Look forward to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Everybody have a great week.